On the morning of April 23, 1996, Bastrop, Texas was an ordinary place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. The sun had not yet risen over the pine forests that surrounded the small town located roughly 30 miles southeast of Austin. The darkness before dawn is a particular kind of darkness. Thick, complete, and indifferent to the lives unfolding within it. For 19-year-old Stacy Stites, this darkness would mark the boundary between her life before and the way she would be, remembered by everyone who came after. Stacy Stites was a young woman in the process of building a life. She was engaged to be married. She had a job that required her to wake up before the sun rose and drive through the darkness to get to work. These were the markers of an adult life in progress. Responsibilities, commitments, a future that stretched ahead in a way that only 19-year-olds, with their unshakable belief that time is infinite, can fully believe in. She worked at a local business, and her commute took her along Highway 21, a rural road that connected the sleeping town of Bastrop to the places where people went to earn their living. It was a drive she had made countless times before, the kind of drive that becomes automatic. The same route, the same time of day, the same darkness punctuated eventually by the first light of morning. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be different from any other morning. Stacy's fiancé was a police officer named Jimmy Fennell. He was a man whose job was to protect the community, to enforce the law, to stand between order and chaos. He was, by profession and by the very nature of his work, a man who represented safety. On the night of April 22nd, as Stacy prepared for her early morning drive, everything in her world was exactly as it should have been. She had a job. She had a fiancé. She had a life that made sense within the context of the small Texas town where she lived. In the early morning darkness of April 23rd, Stacy Stites got into her fiancé's truck and began the drive to work. The roads were nearly empty. The sky was still black. She was alone on a rural highway in the darkness before dawn, a vulnerability that no amount of future planning or present safety measures could eliminate. She was simply a young woman driving to work, as millions of young people do every day, in places where they should be safe, doing ordinary things. Hours passed. Stacy did not arrive at work. Hours became more hours. The absence that had begun as a simple, unexplained lateness grew into something that could not be ignored. People began asking questions. Where was Stacy? Why hadn't she arrived? Why wasn't she answering her phone? The search began almost immediately, driven by the rising panic of people who cared about her, who knew her, who suddenly understood that her absence meant something was wrong, very wrong. Along a rural roadside near Bastrop, searchers discovered Stacy Stites. She was no longer on her way to work. She was no longer on her way anywhere. Her body lay discarded, like an object that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled with a belt, an object that had been wound around her neck with enough force to end her life. The autopsy would later reveal the violence of her final moments. The belt had left its mark, a physical record of the last thing she experienced before consciousness ended and her body became evidence. The discovery of Stacy's body transformed what had been a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The search for a lost young woman became the search for a killer. And in that transformation, Bastrop, Texas became a place where a murder had occurred, where a killer had walked free, where a community suddenly understood that the darkness that had taken Stacy could be anywhere, in any car on any road, in any person who lived among them. The investigation began with the most basic questions. Who had seen Stacy last? Who knew her? Who had access to her fiancé's truck? Who would have known that a young woman would be driving alone on a rural highway in the darkness before dawn? The truck belonged to Jimmy Fennell, Stacy's fiancé. The fiancé is always examined. First in these cases, it is a truth that everyone in law enforcement understands. But Jimmy Fennell was a police officer. He was a man whose job was to solve crimes, not commit them. He was a man trusted by his community. And yet, he was the man whose truck had been used, whose fiancé had been murdered, whose connection to Stacy was the most intimate connection any of the people in her life possessed. Investigators began gathering evidence. The body held evidence. The truck held evidence. The roadside where she was discovered held evidence. And in the darkness before dawn, on April 23, 1996, the killer, whoever he was, had left something behind. Something that would not be understood fully for decades. Something that would eventually point toward a name, but also away from certainty, away from closure, away from anything resembling simple truth. That something was DNA. DNA evidence in 1996 was still relatively new to the American criminal justice system. It was not yet the ubiquitous tool it would become. It was not yet the kind of evidence that could be found anywhere and could point directly to guilt with mathematical certainty. But it was powerful. It was scientific. It was objective in a way that eyewitness testimony could never be. It was a voice from the biological world speaking into the legal world, carrying information that could not lie, could not be mistaken, could not be denied. The autopsy of Stacy Stites revealed sperm cells. During the sexual assault, the killer had left behind biological evidence. The sperm cells were collected, preserved, and sent to a laboratory where scientists could extract DNA and create a genetic profile as a unique biological fingerprint that belonged to exactly one person on Earth. The DNA profile was created. It was run through databases, and it matched a man named Rodney Reed. Rodney Reed was a local man. He was a black man in a town where that fact carried weight, carried history, carried the accumulated prejudices of a place and a time. He was a man who could be arrested. He was a man who could be prosecuted. He was a man who could be tried and convicted and sentenced to death. Prosecutors built their case on the DNA evidence. They argued that Rodney Reed had abducted Stacy Stites during her early morning commute on Highway 21. They argued that he had forced her into the truck. They argued that he had driven her to a location where he sexually assaulted her. They argued that he had strangled her with a belt. They argued that he had abandoned her body along a rural roadside. And they argued that the DNA evidence, the sperm cells, found during her autopsy, proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Rodney Reed was the man who had done all of these things. At trial, the prosecutors called forensic experts to testify. These experts explained the science of DNA to the jury. They explained how sperm cells degrade over time. They explained that the presence of intact sperm tails, the flagella that allow sperm cells to move, suggested that the sexual activity had occurred shortly before Stacy's death. They argued that this timing was critical because it supported the prosecution's theory that Rodney Reed had raped Stacy immediately before murdering her, that the assault and the murder were part of the same crime, committed by the same man in quick succession. The logic was compelling. The science seemed clear. The DNA evidence seemed to eliminate all reasonable doubt. Rodney Reed was convicted. Rodney Reed was sentenced to death, but Rodney Reed maintained his innocence. Even as he sat in prison, even as he awaited execution, he told the same story over and over. He admitted that the DNA found on Stacy belonged to him. He did not deny the biological evidence, but he offered a different explanation for why his DNA was there. He claimed that he and Stacy Stites had been involved in a consensual sexual relationship. He claimed that the two had met secretly, that they had been intimate, that Stacy had kept the relationship hidden because she was engaged to Jimmy Fennell. He claimed that when Stacy's body was found, his DNA was on her because they had been sexually active together, but not on the morning of April 23rd, not as part of a violent crime, as part of a consensual relationship that Stacy had chosen to keep secret. This claim created a space of uncertainty. It created a crack in the seemingly solid foundation of the prosecution's case. If Rodney Reed and Stacy Stites had been involved in a consensual relationship, then the presence of his DNA proved nothing about whether he had murdered her. The DNA only proved that they had been intimate at some point. It did not prove when. It did not prove the circumstances. It did not prove consent or lack thereof. It did not prove that the sexual activity had occurred on the morning of her death. And this is where the science of sperm degradation, the very science that prosecutors had relied upon to prove that the sexual activity occurred shortly before death, became a point of contention. In the years after Rodney Reed's conviction, new information emerged, and this new information created questions that could not be unasked, that could not be ignored, that demanded answers. Witnesses came forward with statements about Stacy Stites. They claimed that Stacy had been involved with a black man. They claimed that this relationship was secret. They claimed that Stacy had kept it, hidden from Jimmy Fennell, because she was engaged to him. This testimony supported Reed's claim that the two had been involved in a consensual relationship. But more troubling questions emerged about the investigation itself. Evidence came to light, suggesting that statements had been made to investigators that were allegedly never turned over to the defense. Evidence suggested that information about Stacy's relationships and her activities had not been fully disclosed. The Brady Rule, the legal principle that prosecutors must turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense, seemed to have been violated. And then there was Jimmy Fennell. Jimmy Fennell was Stacy's fiancé. Jimmy Fennell was a police officer. Jimmy Fennell was a man who had been present in the investigation, who had access to information, who was connected to the victim in the most intimate way possible. For decades, Jimmy Fennell remained simply the grieving fiancé, the man who had lost his bride-to-be to a violent killer. But in 2019, more than 2 decades after Stacy's murder, Jimmy Fennell was arrested for kidnapping and sexual assault. While serving as a police officer, he had abducted and sexually assaulted a woman. He was convicted. He went to prison. And suddenly, the narrative of the Stacy Stites case shifted. If Jimmy Fennell was capable of kidnapping and sexual assault while serving as a police officer, was he also capable of murdering his fiancée? Had investigators focused too quickly on Rodney Reed? Had they ignored evidence that pointed toward Jimmy Fennell? Had they overlooked the obvious suspect because he wore a badge? These questions were no longer speculative. They were grounded in the documented reality of Jimmy Fennell's later crimes. They were grounded in the fact that a man close to the victim, a man with access to her, a man with knowledge of her routines, had later demonstrated a capacity for sexual violence. The murder weapon was a belt that had been wound around Stacy's neck with enough force to strangle her, a belt that had been recovered as evidence, a belt that, like everything else in the case, could have been tested for DNA. But the belt had not been tested for DNA, not in 1996, not in the years immediately following. The belt remained in evidence storage, a physical object that might contain the biological signature of the killer, but which had never been analyzed. Decades later, as doubt grew about Rodney Reed's conviction, questions were raised about testing the belt. If the belt was tested for DNA, it might reveal whose hands had held it. It might prove that Rodney Reed had never touched it. It might point toward a different killer. It might provide evidence that could exonerate a man on death row. But the belt has not been fully tested. The courts have debated requests for DNA testing on the belt. The legal system has moved slowly, as it always does, caught in procedures and precedents, and the question of who has the authority to order such testing and when. And so the belt remains a potential source of truth, a potential key to unlocking the real narrative of what happened on April 23rd, 1996. But it remains untested. It remains a symbol of the uncertainty that surrounds this case, the uncertainty that surrounds Rodney Reed's conviction, the uncertainty that no amount of legal proceedings has been able to eliminate. Nearly 3 decades later, the murder of Stacy Stites remains one of the most debated criminal cases in the country. The DNA evidence that seemed so conclusive, so scientific, so objective, has become the center of a controversy that touches on everything. The reliability of forensic science, the possibility of wrongful conviction, the danger of focusing too quickly on one suspect, the capability of men in positions of authority to commit violent crimes, the slow and imperfect nature of justice. Did DNA solve the case? Or did it only tell part of the story, a part that pointed in one direction while obscuring what lay in another?